So anyway, so what do we know? Things we know about young adult readers. So this is the baseline for thinking about what might be happening with older readers. We know that they make fixations at around about a quarter of a second long. We know that they fixate most of the words in the text and usually make about 1 or 2 fixations on the words. We know things about the general length of the saccades that they make. It seems to be fairly regular. It's around about 8 or 9 letters and carries in general the eye from one word to approximately the next word along. About 10 to 15% of the fixations they make actually follow regression, so quite a lot, a fair amount of time, 1 in 10, 1 in 6 fixations that follow a movement that's going backwards in the text. And that's from one word to another, so that doesn't take account of the regressions that might be made within a word. And the idea behind that is that there's perhaps something going wrong, there's some sort of misanalysis that's taking place, so the eye is going back in order to re-inspect this earlier portion of text in order to try and make sense. We also know that there's a systematicity to where the fixations land within words, so we see the so-called optimal viewing position, which typically falls just short of the sense of the word. And if you looked at a plot of the sorts of fixations that might be made in a word of a particular length that occurs in a passage of text, you get a fairly nice normal distribution to it, where the peak is around about this optimal position, just to the left of the centre of the word. So we're okay with this. I know we spend quite a lot of time explaining these sorts of things to the older readers. What's really interesting, though, is that you can see effects, you can see differences. There are quite sharp differences in the performance of older adults, healthy older adults. So these are people typically that take part, the people that take part in these sorts of experiments, and we quite carefully screen these individuals to make sure that they're not reporting that they suffer from any form of eye disease. That can be quite difficult to do. If you speak to ophthalmologists, they'll tell you that anyone over about the age of mid-50s has probably got some form of cataract developing. In the 60s, there's probably at least some level of cataract, which is probably very important, might be very important for some of the effects that we're going to describe, might be very important for the baseline effects that are reported in the literature. But the things you find is that these older adults typically read considerably more slowly, and I'll show you some data to show you just exactly how much more slowly they read. They make more and they make longer fixations. They jump ahead much further in the text, so they quite often skip words, for those of you who are interested in skipping, but they certainly make longer progressive saccades, but they also make a lot more regressions. And actually, a lot of the increased amount of fixations they make and a lot of the increased amount of reading time that they have is due to these regressions. It's due to the fact that they're going back and rereading chunks of text. And I've already said that we're more likely to skip words. Now, as people have argued, particularly Keith Rayner's argued, that what this might reflect is that these older adults are employing what he described as a riskier reading strategy. So they're moving further. For a start, perhaps they're having greater difficulty in processing the text, and therefore are being more likely to guess, use the word guess carefully, but guess the identities of words on the basis of partial information because of the difficulty they're having in processing text. As a consequence, they're moving further ahead more frequently, so they're making these lots of skipping because they're guessing the identity of the next word along and skipping it, but they're also quite often getting that wrong, so they're making errors and having to go back and correct these errors, hence the increased number of regressions, hence the inflated reading times. So that's the stuff that's been shown from the studies that have been done, typically looking at just basic eye movement experiments, looking at the characteristics of the eye movements that are made by these older groups of readers in comparison with groups of younger readers.
Sorry, did you say that they make more regressions because they're more likely to skip the words, or are they making more regressions generally?
They're making more regressions generally, probably because they're making more errors in guessing identities of words. Even in guessing the identity of the word, they're not necessarily going to skip that word, yeah, but they certainly go back to sometimes.
So the skipping and the regression doesn't go hand in hand.
I don't think.
They've not done it so precisely.
Yeah, nobody knows for certain, but I wouldn't think there would be I don't think there's not a perfect correspondence between that. There's no reason why there would be. It probably is related to some extent, however.
You see one going up and you see the other going up, right? So as they made more skipping, they also made more regressions. So the presumption is that they're going back to check the words after they've misguessed them.
Yeah,
I think that's as far as Keith's got on it, isn't it?
I think that's right. But you don't. You might, even if you got the word wrong,
Yeah.
you might not have skipped it. You might still have to go
Yeah.
back because you still misanalyzed that word.
And it's both right, so you've got sort of distribution of two kinds of regressions. One's directly off the skip to check, but they will, I think, also do slightly more rereading.
Yeah, I think that's right too.
Okay.
So I think both of them are in there.
The older adults were easy to deal with. Perceptual span, we all know what the perceptual span is. There's another nice thing. We all know what the perceptual span is, don't we? The point of this was just to explain this to the older adults that we do have this perceptual span. We know the size of it for young adults. It's something like 3 or 4 characters to the left of the word that's being looked, although that might not be entirely correct. And it's something like 14 to 15 characters to the right. So basically the next 2 words along, roughly, is the perceptual span for younger readers. What we find for older adults is their perceptual span. This is the only one study has looked at this very closely, and that's a Rayner study, which shows the perceptual span seems to be more symmetrical for older adults. And this is important for the stuff I'm coming on to in a second. More symmetrical for older adults, so they seem to extract information about the word they're looking at, the word to the left, and the word to the right. So it's smaller and more symmetrical. Right, we're okay with all of that. So that was kind of most of the introductory stuff. So when I talk to groups of WI groups about the perceptual span, which, as you would imagine, blew their minds because they hadn't really thought about that before in general, even though many of them are teachers, etc. So they find that very interesting. But the next thing that's kind of often overlooked and is it's a question not just of how much of the span of text is being acquired on each fixation, but what is the nature of that information that's been acquired from that span of text? What exactly is it that's being taken from the page and processed visually in order to help you to identify the words? And this is where we get onto the data, the experiments that we've been doing, and the sort of findings that we have, which I think might tell us something interesting about differences between young and older adults. So the approach we've taken has been to think about exactly what sorts of information might be acquired from the page, what sorts of visual information might be acquired, and then to think about how that might differ between young and older adults in terms of what is known about the characteristics of their visual processing in general. And the way we did that was using a filtering technique, which I'll show you in a second. So look, I think it's easiest if I talk a bit about. Right, I'll read this in different order. So first of all, what sorts of things might be seen? What do we know about the way in which visual information is processed? Well, a lot of studies, particularly stuff by Colin Blakemore and colleagues in the 60s and other stuff since then, have looked at visual processing in terms of sensitivity to spatial frequency information. So mostly these studies use these sorts of gratings, where you've got a sinusoidal wave, which is either very high frequency, quite lots of bands of information, it's giving you very fine detail, or it's very it's got lower frequency, and therefore you get more sort of larger chunks of information. And you can use these sorts of gratings in order to test the contrast sensitivity function of an individual. So you can see what sorts of visual information can be detected by the visual system, and that is argued that this forms the basis for the way in which people see and process visual information in their environment. Does that make sense? Now, what's interesting about this is that the work that's been done with in ophthalmology shows that there are changes that occur naturally as we get older, even in the healthy visual system. So, if you look at the visual systems of older adults, they show reduced sensitivity to spatial frequency information in general, so their ability to receive these sorts of gratings and report on what they're seeing is reduced, they perform less well, but they also show particular loss of sensitivity to spatial frequencies at the high spatial frequency end, so to the higher spatial frequencies. Now the function of these high spatial frequencies, I think I had some more on the slide, yes I did. The function of these high spatial frequencies is to provide you with information about the visual detail. So if I look at the picture, the lovely picture you have on the wall behind you, then we can think about that. That was stupid, wasn't it? You're all having to turn your head. If you imagine the object in front of you, you can describe this in terms of coarse details. It's got a sort of box-like feature to it. It's a black shape against a sort of lighter coloured background. And you can think about it just in terms of having that shape. And that coarse scale information might be very important to you. For example, if you've been navigating your way around this room, you want to make sure you can see the objects in the room in a sort of coarse-grained way. So just the rough shape of the object, so that you don't bump into them and fall over them. But in order to do that, you don't really need to know much about the detail that exists within those objects. So you don't need to know about exactly where these pens are, or where all the sort of interesting detail that occurs on the screen, or the texture of this lovely wooden table, or how the chairs are made. So we can think that we might respond to objects in different ways depending on the level of detail that's analysed. But you can also think that the visual system is attuned to being able to detect all those different levels of detail. Now what seems to happen is that as we get older is that we lose sensitivity to that fine visual detail. People don't see the detail that's present in objects with such clarity as they did when they were younger. Now, why might this occur? Well, cataracts are going to be a definite cause of that sort of loss of sensitivity to fine detail. Other things that happen is that the liquid within the eye, the fluid within the eye, becomes more viscous and is less opaque, so the transmission of the visual information through the eye is reduced as well. Another possibility that some people have argued for is that there are changes take place in the speed of neurotransmission within the two major visual pathways within the brain, and that particularly the pathway that deals with primarily high spatial frequency information, and that slowing might also impede the ability to process high spatial frequencies very efficiently. Does that make sense? So we have a situation where as we get older we lose our ability to process high spatial frequencies of information. That might have consequences. Well, what the question we were interested in was what consequences might that have for the way in which we read and process words. Might that provide some sort of explanation for some of the differences we might see in the performance of young and older readers? Now, another important point that I should make is that you probably don't need all of this. I kind of already made it when I talked about navigating the way around the room. You don't need all this information often in order to be able to process or recognise objects sufficiently well to be able to perform everyday functions. So for example, we can all see this as a car, even though it lacks the fine visual detail. So you can't see any of it in any detail, you can't pick out the details within the object, but it's instantaneously recognisable as a car. Now you might, I can talk about how that might apply to reading once I've shown you some of the data. Is this okay so far? But I'll talk about it just now. So, things I've said about ageing is that you get this progressive deterioration in the visual sense system, either in the eye or in the brain, that's producing this loss of sensitivity to fine visual detail. And this might have consequences for reading. And what's important about this is that glasses aren't going to correct for this particularly well. So the loss of processing ability is beyond just loss of acuity. Now, what that might do, what we've suggested, is this might lead older adults to rely more heavily on other sorts of cues, such as word shape information or contextual information, in order to compensate for this reduced visibility of letters. And you can start to think about how that might fit into the sort of riskier guessing strategy that Rayner's described older adults adopt when they, in order to read.
How can you quantify the loss of processing ability beyond the visual?
For an individual?
Yeah, so you know, you could correct, say I'm 60 or 65 or something older, and I've kind of got a loss of some, and some of my loss of ability to be able to see because I need glasses, so I can put a pair of glasses on, but you're saying there's some extra there, right?
So,
and how do you quantify that?
So you can use different. You could chart out the whole contrast sensitivity function, so you could use ratings in order to show what they're capable of seeing. But there are other sorts of charts that are used as well. So the charts that are typically used are primarily, I mean, they're tapping into it, but they're just not fully tapping into it. So you usually get a a high contrast chart as a test for visual acuity, and you can see how far down that chart you go. There's other charts with contrast sensitivity, like the Pelly-Robson chart, which shows you letters that where the difference between the boldness of the letters and the background become less clear, so the contrast is
So
reduced.
the idea is that you basically use some kind of psychophysical type thing to assess how much beyond the glasses there's a lot of information. Okay.
So then, when you're talking to groups of older adults, a useful thing to do to engage them in this and to get them to think about this is to give them some sort of interesting task to do. It had occurred to me to delete this, and I thought, what the hell? Time I've got through the dealing with the spatial frequencies, we could always do the task. So this notion that you don't need all the visual information, certainly not that fine visual detail in order to perform relatively well, is easily demonstrated by getting you to name some of these people. So do you think you can do it?
No.
Some of them. It's got an American twist to it because it happened to be an American website that stole this from.
About half of them, I think.
So with highly familiar items, which could be words, you don't really need all the visual information to be there. You don't need all the detail there in order to be able to process it efficiently. Now, and just to think about, there's some arguments presented from a sort of evolutionary perspective as well, is that another reason for not requiring all visual information to be present in an object in order to be able to identify it is it allows you to respond more quickly, because the pathways that deal primarily with the coarse scale, the low spatial frequency content, pretty fast. So if a tiger jumps out at you from the corner, you don't need to know the precise shape of its teeth or the texture of its pattern on its back. You just need to know that's probably a tiger in order to be able to respond to it.
Is that true?
It's an argument that's made, but you can see how it would work. And you can see how it works here. So we can identify these individuals without being able to see the detail.
Those under 21.
21. That's
Mother
Mother Teresa.
Teresa.
Mother Teresa.
Not married.
Go on. Okay, so things we did. So the things we did was we used these sorts of psychophysical approaches to be able to reduce the quality of the visual information that's present in bits of words or text around about the words, or in the last version I'll show you the entire sentence. In order to see, there's several interesting questions about that. Is first of all, how much visual information do young readers, young skilled readers, in fact, have to be able to see in order to read normally? Do they need to see the full range of spatial frequencies that are present in the word, or can they perform relatively well when some of that information is absent? And what sort of information are they acquiring? And then the other question is there a difference in performance between the young and older readers? And might this tell us anything about the effects of ageing the visual system on their reading performance? So now the downside of this is that some of the things we've done don't reproduce necessarily very well, and the exact distance at which you're viewing it will also affect the spatial frequencies that you're acquiring from the screen. So we were doing all this at a set viewing distance so that we can define what the characteristics of those spatial frequencies are. So we can think about this in terms of just that there are, so there's 3 levels that we're using in most of the experiments, and some other levels of filtering in other experiments. So this is text presented normally. Shouldn't have done that, should I? So text presented normally is the first one. This is one where we're using a filter that leaves only the low spatial frequency information. So you can see that this is quite a small window we've used here. So the text within the word, the middle 3 letters of that, have had that fine detail, the higher spatial frequency content extracted so that there's only relatively low spatial frequency information left, with the effect of essentially blurring those letters so that the detail of the letters is lost and the rough shape of the letters is retained. Middle one, the bottom one is where there's only relatively high spatial frequency information left, and there's also a mid-range one we used as well.
I reviewed this, didn't I? I reviewed this. I gave you a really hard time.
Yes.
I thought I was.
I can't remember if it was this one. It might have been, yes, it was one of these ones.
One of the ones he gave you a hard time on.
Always gives people a hard time, always gives us a hard time. So the logic of the approach is, so if some of the information, if you need information to be present in order to read, then it's going to make reading more difficult if that information is missing.
So Kevin, right, let's nail this now. It seems to me, when I'm looking at that, you're telling me that you've got 3 there that have modifications done to them, yeah?
Yeah.
The one at the bottom has had all the low frequency stuff taken out, has it?
Just with the contours to the letters effectively left.
So there is all the high frequency information in the bottom one,
Yes.
right? Then the middle one, there's a mixture of both, is that right?
Yeah, these are slightly overlapping bands, but yeah.
So if you ask everybody in this room, right, of those, which do you think is the hardest to read? Put your hand up if you think it's the bottom line. Put your hand up if you think it's the next to the bottom line. Put your hand up if you think it's the second line down. Yeah, okay. That's right.
You think this one's the hardest?
No, second line down.
Oh, this one.
Oh, no, yeah.
Well, okay.
But
Well,
then that's because we're looking straight at it, and what he's measuring, is it in your peripheral
No,
vision,
no.
is it? Or
no, this is central.
This is what he's
oh,
going to say.
this is
But
your
I'll explain
measuring, oh, yeah.
I'll explain that bit. I haven't got to that bit yet, but I'll explain that bit in a second. But there's a complication to this, is that, well, actually, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that, apart from the fact that the age range here is quite interesting.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
for the most part, people here are
What are you saying?
Just be
careful.
the vast majority of individuals in this room are under 30, I think, and that's crucial for the report you made. And the older individuals, if they agree with you, are showing.
For being a nice guy.
But the older individuals are showing great resilience in the individual systems if they're being able to agree with the younger crowds, younger generations present. So what we did.
But it's an interesting thing, right? I'm saying that for a reason, that if you ask everybody, the intuition is that second line down looks the one that's going to be hardest to read. Right?
Where
This one
actually,
here.
I would say the bottom one from this viewing distance, because I find it really, really faint.
Okay.
And I think I would be more able to decipher what the second one down was, because it's dark.
Okay.
It looks like a distant thing too, right? If you're close by, number 2 is worse than far off probably.
So the spatial frequencies depend on viewing distance as well. So that it's not distance in there.
So it could be from here, number 4 is pretty readable, but I can imagine from earlier you've indicated that number 4 deteriorates more as you move further away.
So it's more about my eyesight than anything else.
Okay, I can't really tell the differences at all, but just so are each sentence is band passed
Yeah.
with spatial
Well,
frequency?
it's notch. Well, they're all 3 with notch filters, but yeah, it's a lower band and an upper band.
Okay, so each one is band passed through certain bandwidth of
Yes.
okay. Well, because I can't see.
Only the middle word, Shui, the word would.
Yeah, in this experiment, and this is a moving window, a moving filter experiment. We're calling this. So this filtering that's taking place is contingent on the location that's being fixated. So wherever the reader looks, that a symmetrical filter is presented in that location wherever they look, and it's contingent with their algorithm. So standard type of perceptual span type experiment, we vary the size of that filter, but whereas in the perceptual span experiment, the text within that window would be shown normally, the text outside would be obscured in some way, usually with X's or something like that. We're doing it slightly differently. So we're manipulating the content within the window by using this filtering technique, and the text outside that window in this experiment is presented normally. And the size of the window is varied from, I think you'll see in the next slide, so it's from, essentially it's from quite small to covering what would normally be considered the foveal range, certainly most of the foveal range. We're using symmetrical windows. Now we know that the perceptual span is asymmetric for young adults. It doesn't appear to be asymmetric for older adults. But frankly, we had no idea what was going to go on, what was going to happen to the left and right of fixation. So we followed the very early perceptual span experiments in using a symmetrical filter. And some of the stuff we've done more recently has been playing around with asymmetric filters to see see if there's different types of sensitivity to the left and to the right of that central point of fixation. But are we okay on what happened on this? So we've got this moving filter that's, wherever you're looking, the text is changed so that it's either it's just the lower spatial frequency information, the sort of mid-range of spatial frequencies, or the higher range of spatial frequencies are present. And your bet is, particularly the very young people in the room, are betting that this one is the I'm betting this second one down is the hardest.
I think so.
The other three you find sort of the same, you would say, if you were judging it. Which is great, because this is what young people do. So, and obviously I'm going to have to talk you through it because you won't be able to make too much sense of this. So we're just looking at extended reading time. Actually, the other sort of main measures, things like the average fixation duration and the number of fixations made, show the same pattern in essence. So I'm just going to talk about this. And I can talk about what differences we've found in general between the young and older readers with normal text as well, if I remember. So different 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different size, normal text plus 5 different sizes. I've called it window a bit, filter size, symmetrical filters around the point of fixation. What you find is that for young adults, the normal text doesn't differ from any of the sizes of filter for the medium or fine, that's the medium and the high spatial frequency content. So that was the third and fourth options that you found pretty easy, but maybe a bit faint. Don't cause hardly any disruption at all. This is in, everyone was under 30 who took part in that young group. So what's interesting about that? So that gave us a baseline, but it actually kind of surprised us at the same time, because it says that around about this central region of fixation, you don't seem to need to have all the spatial frequency information to be present in order to be able to read normally, almost entirely normally. Now that kind of flies in the face of lots of things that people assume about the way in which the eye is controlled when we read, because the assumption is, when you look at the literature and things like optimal viewing position effects and preferred viewing position effects, that the reason that we fixate just the left and the centre of the word is actually because the eye is being programmed to land at the centre of the word, in order that the majority of that word is projecting to those regions of the retina that can process it in highest acuity, process it in most detail. But this experiment is suggesting that actually you don't need that much detail to be, if you're young and under 30 and you've good eyesight, you don't need to...
Actually, to be very fair, what that's telling you is that you don't need it at foveation, but you do perhaps need it in the parafoveal to target the saccades, right? So that's not quite what you said.
Well, okay, the eye movement people would say that you're targeting the centre of the word in order to control the
and that would be a
movement
fuzzy blob in your parafoveal,
Yeah.
which will be based on presumably more spatial frequency information, right?
Yeah, that's okay. But the people like Kevin O'Regan would argue that the reason why you want to fixate the centre of the word is for that reason, that the majority of the word is being seen in the highest possible acuity. These data suggest that certainly in textual reading that's not required. Because you don't need all of the information there to be able to read, you're going to say pretty well, as good as normal text.
So in that case, if you just bend past the whole sentence, shouldn't that have some sort of effect? If you are saying it's just, as long as it's just part of the spatial information available, that would be sufficient. Then if you bend past the whole sentence, that shouldn't matter.
Yes, I'll show you that in a minute.
Oh, sorry.
As the window gets larger, when the window of the low spatial frequencies, the blurry text you didn't like, is quite small, then it doesn't have too much of an effect on these young adults' reading performance. As it gets larger, you see the disruption come in. But what's interesting is that the pattern for older adults is very different. They showed us beyond just the one character that's being disrupted, beyond that size of filter, they're showing disruption across all of these cases, no matter what the type of filtering is being used. But the pattern has switched around. So the disruption is greatest, I've touched that again. The disruption is greatest when it's the high spatial frequencies that are only present in that region of fovea. It's less for the low spatial frequencies, and it happens to be lowest for the medium spatial frequencies. But importantly, that difference between high and low has switched around. It's different from what's here. So that is consistent with the view that as we get older, visual system deteriorates. It's less sensitive overall to spatial frequency content, but it's that sensitivity, loss of sensitivity is created for higher spatial frequencies. So when only the high spatial frequencies are present, the older readers are finding this text quite difficult to read.
Why doesn't the median pattern intermediately relative to the fine and coarse?
I don't know. I think this is just the sweet information. This is this is information that everybody finds probably easiest overall. Because it's going to be, I don't know. But we find this repeatedly. So I don't know. Does that sound okay? Can I move on? So what we also did was, the other question is, well, what happens to parafoveal processing of text? What happens when there's text in the periphery that's filtered in this way? Do you see the same sort of preferences? Are there any other interesting things we can find out about this? So we did a couple of other experiments, and I'm just going to show you the data from one of those, where we compared text so this is text presented normally, and where there's a window, and in the filter conditions, there's a window of normal text that's again symmetrical around point fixation, and that was varied in size. And the question was, how large did that window of normal text have to be in order for reading performance to be equivalent to normal? And the text outside that moving window had either these low spatial frequencies, medium spatial frequencies, or the high spatial frequencies. And what we found, so it's quite hard to think of this, it's actually the same pattern but reversed, if that makes any sense. But there's two interesting things about this. First of all, we see the same, for young adults, we see the same cost for these low spatial frequencies compared to high and medium, which differ from normal with the very smallest size of window, but there's very little difference in once the window extends beyond about three characters wide. For the older adults, we again see the switch around. So we see that there's greatest cost for when it's only high spatial frequencies present, less cost again for the low spatial frequencies, and this medium seems to just be really good for them. They find that less disruptive. But what was interesting was that there's also a difference in the size of the window across which this operates, and we're not entirely sure why this is, but it might be interesting. So reading is entirely normal by the time you get to around about a window of 15 characters for the young adults.
Quick question, Kevin. What was the average saccade size in?
We're finding longer saccades for
the older?
For the older adults.
Yeah.
Interestingly, in both of these experiments, we find absolutely no difference in the performance when text is presented entirely normally. So the reading times are almost identical for young and older adults. The saccade size is different.
How old are the older adults? Are they like 90?
No. So these guys are we're sampling from about 65 to we've had a couple in the 80s. But it's generally what we call young old, so it's generally sort of between 65, maybe up to 75. Beyond 75, they have other problems, they have mobility problems.
So I think Keith's older adults were near 85, weren't they?
Well, it's another thing we do,
Yeah.
which is we test the acuity and we test them on a range of visual abilities before we let them in the lab. And if they're not showing reasonable performance, so if they're showing low vision, we exclude them because that's going to explain the bulk of the difficulty they're encountering. I'm not sure all labs do those visual tests as thoroughly as we have.
How about background for your other participants?
We match them. Everyone's matched in educational background, so there's the same number of years in education. We ask them to self-report reading the amount of reading they do as well, and that's matched.
So I would argue I don't know. Well, let me put it in my own country because I know that system best. A person from that age who had higher education will have a different background than a person from university now has higher education. And quite often it will be more literate, like in terms of how much they read and interest in things like that.
Well, they're matched on the self-reported interest in reading and the amount of reading they do each week.
Yeah.
So we try to control self-reported, so we've done our best to control for that. But the acuity stuff's really important. No, in general, I don't think there's that many labs, even with young adults who are screening for visual acuity. So we screen, young adults are screened as well. So if they show less than, in fact, if they don't show normal vision, we throw them out. We don't include anyone with any form of visual impairment. Glasses fine, so as long as they can pass the chart.
So they wear the glasses to read.
Yeah.
Because I'm assuming
A lot of the older adults
are
are having to wear glasses to read.
I wondered whether you found or looked for differences in landing sites for landing positions for the three conditions, whether there was any difference.
We haven't looked at that, but I'm going to talk about that at the very end. Okay? In a different experiment. So anyway, so those are all the moving window experiments. Well, we've done various others, but I thought they were quite interesting. They show the same general pattern, so the issue there is that we are seeing differences, and the most pronounced difference is this difference in sensitivity, we think, to spatial frequency information is showing through in terms of how these sentences are processed. We also did it with just entirely filtered sentences to see what would happen, and I think this shows the same sort of pattern, so I'll just go through this quite quickly. So this was your question, what happens if you just filter the whole sentence? And we used a broader range of filters here. So this one here is equivalent to the low frequency filter that I showed you previously. This is the medium one you saw previously. This is the high spatial frequency filter you saw previously. Then we've got an extreme high frequency filter, which in this is probably, this is almost unreadable on this screen, but what will be interesting is for me to show you what the Okay. I've spent ages doing that, so but these are sort of general conclusions. So young adults have no difficulty when only these high spatial frequencies are present in text, which I think is quite surprising, quite interesting. They don't require much information to be able, they don't require much information to be able to read, they only really require this. Now what's interesting is that those high spatial frequencies may well be providing the sorts of information that's required to identify letters. But actually they're also providing enough information, enough low spatial frequency information to be able to work out where the words begin and end on the page. You can still work out the boundaries between words. So that's probably sufficient to help with targeting of movements. Older adults are having difficulty when only that information is present. They also appear to require, when we filter them peripherally, they require an even larger portion of text to be normal in order to be able to read normally. And so at a very sort of simple level, it suggests that this is evidence that young and older adults are using different qualities of information, different amounts of information in order to read. And that's a sort of general conclusion. Okay. Do you want me to tell you about the other experiment that I tagged on to the end of this, because I thought it might be interesting for you to know, because
Yeah.
but you want me to stop?
Okay.
Okay.
Well, if anyone wants to go, they can go.
I've heard about my daughter.
Yeah. Super.
So what we did is we also wanted, so I've done two things in this experiment. We were interested in tackling a question that lots of you have tackled here, so it's with the coordination of binocular eye movements. And we wondered if there would be an age difference. Now, why? And the second related question was we were interested in seeing how accurately older adults target their fixations within words as they're reading. Now, what reasons would there be to suspect there would be any age differences here? Well, there's not been that much work done on fixation disparity in older adults. There's certainly been none done from the eye movement community. But if you look at ophthalmology, there's been a couple of studies that have been done, most of them quite old, but they do report greater disparity in fixations of older adults compared to younger adults. It's not huge, but there is a difference there. So there was at least a good reason to want to see what happened in older adult readers. If you look at visual search tasks or other sorts of vision-based tasks, then you quite often find quite marked differences between young and older adults. Older adults seem to be poorer at planning saccades, they seem to make more saccadic errors, either in visual search or in things like anti-saccade tasks. So again, we thought that that was a good motivation for being concerned with how accurately older readers might target fixations as they move their eyes across lines of text. So, and that's generally what all this says. I'm just going to skip it. So, so shall I just skip to what we found and tell you what we found from that experiment? Well, interestingly, so if we look at coordination of the eye movements, and I'll show you qualitatively, and then I can just tell you what other non-differences there are. So straight away, there's absolutely no difference in the amount of disparity that young and older adults produce. So this is the amount of disparity in characters, just shown as a proportion of the fixations between the young and older adults. And it should be pretty clear there's absolutely no difference at all. If you look at the proportion of aligned fixations, crossed fixations, and uncrossed fixations, the proportions are very, very similar, statistically not different. If you look at the average amount of disparity that's being produced in terms of number of characters, either for all fixations or for just those unaligned fixations, the numbers are identical. There is absolutely no difference in the average size of the fixation disparity between young and older adults during reading. So it's an entirely non-result. There is no difference. Older adults seem to be able to, over 65s, are able to coordinate their eye movements as efficiently as younger adults are. My colleagues say that eye movement people are obsessed with tables of numbers and never seem to present anything visually. So here's a nice big table to look at, which I thought was quite interesting because it tells us some stuff. The other thing we looked at was effects for short and long words. There's no difference in fixation disparity for short words compared to long words for either short words or long words between young and older adults. And we didn't find any difference in fixation disparity between short words compared to long words either. So word length doesn't seem to affect fixation disparity. Things we did find that were quite interesting were fairly sort of standard effects. So long words are read for longer, and the effect isn't seen in first fixation duration or gaze duration, but is seen in total reading times. Long words get receive more fixations than short words, both during the first pass, but also the overall number of fixations made on words. Short words are skipped much more frequently than long words are, so these are all fairly standard effects in literature. What we also find is nice age differences, so there's very little differences in the first fixation or gaze duration in this experiment, but overall, in the total reading times, the older adults have longer total reading times for words than the younger adults, but they both show the same pattern of effect of word length, and there's no interaction. So you're seeing the same effect of word length on both of the reading performance. And that's the same for the number of fixations. Older adults make more fixations than younger adults, but the effective length is equivalent for the two groups. If I remember correctly, we're seeing more regressions for the older adults, but again, word length effects are the same. And finally, skipping, if I remember correctly, it's the same pattern between young and older adults, but there's a word length effect. That is equivalent again for the two groups. So I thought that was really interesting. Another bunch of null results when it comes to comparing the young and older adults in terms of effects of other phenomena. So we're seeing the same basic phenomena as we see elsewhere. Young adults have got longer reading times, they make more regressions, they skip words more often, but this is uninfluenced by word length, or the influence of word length you see is equivalent for young adults compared to older adults.
So you're not getting for first fix or gaze?
No, nothing came out at all in really on first fix.
So everything that's going on here in terms of the increased reading times is being driven by rereading.
Yeah, yeah.
Which means that, if they identify the words correctly, so you can't really work out whether it's that there's misidentification of words or they kind of identifying more correctly, we're just interpreting them. Having difficulty interpreting them, do you understand what I mean? So, if it was having difficulty identifying the words in the first place, unless they're misidentifying them, you would expect the fixation times, first fix and gaze durations to go up during the first pass with the word, right?
Possibly. But there are other situations in which so if you look at neighbour effects in young adults, except in the most recent Tim Slattery study, perhaps for very good reasons, the effects you see, the neighbour effects you see in reading tend to be in total times and in regressions. So it's a misanalysis. Words are misread in the first pass.
So it depends. They could either be misidentifying the words and then going, oh, I've obviously done something wrong, and then going back and going, no, it wasn't cat, it was rat, or whatever it was, right? And or alternatively, it could be that they get it all right, it's just that there's an interpretation problem downstream. So imagine one scenario where an older person doesn't adequately lexically identify the words in the first instance, gets things wrong, then they'll never form an appropriate interpretation of the sentence, right? The alternative possibility, and maybe both, right? An alternative possibility is that they get all the words right first time, and hence you get comparable first pass reading times, first fix and gaze duration times as the reading it, right? But then, I can't put it all together because I can't hold it in working memory, or I can't do this interpretation thing, or I've got some inadequate discourse representation or construction process. And so what I'm going to do is go back and reread it to try and build it incrementally through a reread, right? Yeah. So I think that's pretty interesting.
That's a really good question. Let me finish that. That's a really good question. So the other thing we did was look at landing positions in words. So these are right and left. I can just summarise this. We looked at the right and left landing positions for young and older adults, long words and short words. There's absolutely no difference. They make exactly the same pattern of landing positions in words. So that's really nice. I felt that, in fact, it was kind of heartening in many ways, because it tells us that that level of very precise ocular and motor control is preserved in these older adults. They're able to carry around.
I would have predicted a difference there. Based on longer saccade length, we know that the longer the saccade length, the standard deviation of the landing position has to spread out. He didn't find that.
Longer. We had longer saccades, but for the target words we used, this is the pattern we got. So
the landing position curves were identical also in terms of standard deviation?
Oh, I'd have to check. I can't think.
It seems to me that there's
I wonder if you'd find differences if you looked at it as a function of sort of launch site then? Is that what
I think we looked at that and we couldn't find anything there either.
Oh, you don't expect it there?
Oh, you wouldn't?
No, because then you get the same launch site. But if adults,
But then
if
you
the
get
older people on
longer.
average take longer, so you add everything together, then you would have on average longer incoming saccade length, hence more standard deviation in the landing position distribution. It would get more messy. Would actually probably take part of the skipping effect in as well.
You've got a cross disparity here, haven't you?
Yes.
Predominant cross disparity.
Both of us tell you that, yes.
But it's running, we're okay with that.
Yeah.
So
We're over that.
We're over that.
you've got cross disparity, and you are finding that there is a disparity, I think, of about a character, if I'm looking at these graphs right.
Very similar numbers
Yeah,
to
to what
what
we've
you
got,
guys
right.
reported.
And
It's crossed.
that is crossed. That's not, no, I think it's perfectly fine. No, that looks good for
Black
us.
letters, white background, normal sort of reading.
Is that right, Kev? Was it black letters on a white background?
Yeah, and the light was on.
And the light was on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Was anyone there?
So,
Just some light jazz in the background.
Did you
A
look
candle
at
arose.
the three different conditions when you did the different types of information in your peripheral vision, look at landing sites then?
we haven't done that, no. I mean, we could go back and look at those data, but it's just not controlled in the same way, because we don't have, when we've got, we'd have to post hoc select to target roads.
But you can still do it.
We could do that, but we wouldn't have a left manipulation, for example, which was nice to have. But we could look at that. I mean, that would hopefully give us some idea of whether these findings can be confirmed. But I thought that pretty neat, I thought. Shall I summarise? So what we're finding, I think we're finding there are nice differences between young and older adults. And I won't make a pitch about why that's so socially relevant, but it really is important because older adults are going to have to continue to read until much longer as we increase things like retirement ages. The things we know is that they find that more difficult to do. There is greater reading difficulty. There may be a smaller perceptual span, as Keith's study suggests. Our study suggests that reduced sensitivity to higher spatial frequencies might be important for how the processing works. They might be using qualitatively different strategy to process words compared to younger adults because they have less, they're able to see the detail in the letters to a much lesser extent. But what's really nice, I think, is that this last study suggests that despite these difficulties, the actual aspects of eye movement control are really well preserved. And that contrasts, I mean, it'd be interesting to know what the vision people think, because that contrasts with what you find, as I said, in visual search tasks or the anti-saccade tasks, where there are often reported quite big age differences. The other thing that I think is important is, of course, for most of what we've done is involve presenting text in a peculiar way. When we present the text, normally, actually they don't do so bad. The reading times we're getting are pretty normal. We're seeing increases elsewhere. We see increased fixation durations. We see different patterns of saccades that other researchers have reported. But the overall reading times are pretty well matched in our experiments, where we've carefully matched the acuity, or carefully assessed the acuity of the individuals taking part. And when we look at the comprehension performance, which we've done very carefully as well, then the older adults do just as well, sometimes better. So, yeah, sometimes better than the younger adults. So what that suggests is that whatever the strategy is that's being used, the so-called riskier strategy, is actually pretty adaptive, and it's actually pretty good at ensuring good comprehension. And so that's a nice message to the WI group when I take this talk to Reds. I'll stop in case. Thank you. And I thought your idea is really good. So is it a higher level integration comprehension process that's going wrong rather than a low level lexical issue? And somebody should look at that.
Are there any questions? Okay.
I guess
sorry,
I've got one, you might have already sort of said this really, but so it looks like older adults are they need detail, regardless of what type of detail, they need detail far more than younger adults do during their foveal vision or during sort of word identification. But yet yet there's no difference in terms of preferred viewing position or the landing position. So that sort of supports what you're saying, that perhaps where we land in a word is not really to do with sort of optimal uptake of visual information. Is that what you're...
Well, I don't know, but for the younger adults, what we're saying flies in the face of the notion that the whole point of fixating in the centre of a word is so that it's seen optimally. Because when we present that text suboptimally, as long as certain types of information is present, then it's still perceived. Now, one possibility is that maybe we know that sensitivity to high spatial frequencies as well as acuity drops off as you go out from the periphery. So maybe it's a strategy of ensuring that it's not high acuity vision, but it's high visuals. Those parts of the retina that are particularly sensitive to high spatial frequencies that's being targeted. But it's not a simple acuity explanation, because we reduce the information that's present and it doesn't matter. You don't actually need to see things perfectly in order to be able to